going to talk about specifically passenger rail service in Iowa City over the years. The railroad has played a prominent role in the history of Iowa City, I think we'd all have to agree, although there's not much evidence of that today, is there? It's taken on many forms over more than 150 years. With today's presentation, I'm going to discuss the many facets of rail travel that have taken place here over a remarkable 158 years. Our rail service has ranged from steam to electric to diesel-powered. I'll begin way back in 1855 when the first locomotive limped silently into the old Iowa City Depot on Johnson Street. It's no longer on Johnson Street. This is an example of a locomotive of that era. Following this, two more railroads came along, with one of them fading away before its rails were even laid. Just after the turn of the 20th century, we always have to say which century now, I guess, don't we? Two electric rail systems came into being. We will learn about how we can still catch a train into Iowa City from Coralville during the fall. Finally, we will learn about a proposal for renewed passenger service to and from Iowa City. Now we begin the drama. It was a cold day in Iowa City, Iowa in late December 1855. The city was very anxious for something to arrive before the new year would come. Iowa City was still a fledgling town and a fledgling state. Although far from the geographical center of the state, it was the capital. State lawmakers came from afar to attend legislative sessions. They came on horseback, by horse and buggy, and by stagecoach. Had their setting been out east, they may have come by rail or water canal. But the railroad had not yet come to Iowa City. Here we see Clinton Street in downtown city in the year 1856, which would have been just after the railroad came to Iowa City. Railroads were so important to the growth and commerce of a town that there was often competition as each town tried to entice the railroad to come its way. Such a rivalry existed between Muscatine and Iowa City in 1855, with each vying for the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad, which had been organized in October of 1852. Iowa City was chosen to be on the main east-west line of the M&M, and so anxious was Iowa City for its coming that a $50,000 prize was offered to the railroad if it would complete its line into town before the arrival of 1856. $50,000 seems to be a pretty big sum for the year 1855. But the railroad was apparently that important for Iowa City to make that kind of an offer. But there was a problem. On December 25th, the rails were still 2.5 miles from Iowa City. As December 31st drew near, it was apparent that the rail line would not be finished on time for the capturing of the bonus. At 9 p.m. on the 31st, the rails were still about 1.5 miles from the station. It was bitterly cold. Bonfires were burning to provide both warmth and light for the desperate workers. Through their heroic efforts, the workers managed to get within 75 yards of the depot by 11 p.m. Many Iowa City residents turned out to pitch in to help complete the task. But as midnight drew near, the steam-powered engine froze up and came to a standstill. A feeling of despair must have set in as everyone realized that the goal would not be attained. But then someone thought of using pinch bars. As men inched the locomotive forward with these bars, the time grew ever so near. But as the church bells rang in the new year, the engine had been moved to the station, thus bringing the drama to a successful close. Here is a mural by Mildred Pelzer depicting the arrival of the locomotive on New Year's Eve, 1855. Was this just in the nick of time arrival of the train on December 31st, 1855, just a fabrication? Well, one prominent Iowa City historian has said so. I'm not sure where he's coming from because I could not find any evidence of that. But anyway, it's certainly a really nice story, and that seems to be what happened anyway. In the 1878 through 1879 Iowa City Directory, it was recalled that, quote, the railway people, reinforced by the whole town, laid temporary ties and rails, enabling the Iron Horse to reach Iowa City promptly on time. But in any event, on January 3rd, despite the minus 20-degree temperature, a special train load of guests from Davenport and the east was cheered on as they arrived on the new railroad. 3 bands played, the guests were escorted to the Capitol building, and an elaborate supper was served in the evening. Here's what the United States railroad system looked like by the year 1850. Of course, you see the buildup out east is where the majority of the rail lines were, and the southeastern part also. In 1840, there were almost 3,000 miles of track, and by 10 years later, over 9,000 miles. And by 1860, the total jumped over 30,000 miles. It just really mushroomed. In the first few years after the railroad arrived, the population of Iowa City more than doubled. The census showed 1,250 people here in 1850 and 5,214 in 1860. And along with that, there was a sharp increase in real estate values. Here's what a typical steam locomotive looked like in 1855. This is what the interior of one of the nicer passenger cars of the day looked like. It wasn't long before a bridge over the Mississippi River was completed, thereby linking the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad with the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad, and thus allowing for travel between the East Coast and Iowa City. But Iowa City was the western terminus of the line. Even by 1860, 5 years later, the railroad only extended across the Iowa River to Oxford. And until 1865, Iowa City was the principal western stopping point for rail transportation. Stepping back a few years, in 1857, the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad ran 2 passenger trains and 2 freight trains each way on a daily basis between Iowa City and Rock Island. At Rock Island, the train connected with the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad for Chicago and the eastern cities with no change of cars between Iowa City and Chicago. I'd like to mention about stagecoaches. In 1857, there was still a need for stagecoach service in Iowa City, even though the railroad had been here a year or more. The city indeed had such service. Coaches left every day for Fort Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, and Washington, Iowa. The stages went beyond these 3 cities to Council Bluffs, Dubuque, Waterloo, Oskaloosa, and Fairfield. Does anyone know about these 3 small homes on South Dubuque Street? Have you seen them? They're about a half a block from the Rock Island Depot, the current old depot. They're said to have been built in 1859. You know of Mrs. Wilfrida Hieronymus. She told the present owner, shop owner, that these homes were used as stagecoach stopovers. Even after the arrival of the railroad in 1855, stagecoaches were still serving the needs of travelers from the north, south, and west. Stagecoaches were in use in the state of Iowa until at least 1870. The owner, who is shown here, he also told me that horses were stabled in the basement via the white door in the back of the building there. Ralston Creek is just a little bit to the east, downslope from those buildings. Here's an image of the first railroad bridge across Iowa River in Iowa City. It was not completed till 1860, more than 4 years after the railroad reached Iowa City from the east. This is a bird's eye view of Iowa City in the 1860s, showing the first depot at Johnson Street, which was, a little less than a half a mile from where it is now on Wright Street. The worldwide panic of 1857 and problems with the management of the railroad had slowed the building progress of the rail line. It wasn't until 1869, a day or two after the driving of the Golden Spike in Promontory Point, Utah, that the rail line was completed from Iowa City all the way to Council Bluffs. In 1869, the Fast Pacific Express ran from Chicago to Council Bluffs in 18 hours, averaging 27.5 miles per hour. For the next few years after 1855, there would be at least two entities that would thank the existence of this new railroad. A group of immigrant religious converts that would push or pull their way westward using hand carts, and an infamous abolitionist and his followers who would soon arrive in Iowa City. So now people could avail themselves of the comforts of travel by rail after just these old terrible stagecoach, bumpy rides and horseback and so forth. They could sit back as their train plowed ahead at a maximum of 20 miles per hour with soot and smoke everywhere. They would stop frequently to take on water. If they came from afar, they could look forward to spending the overnight hours sitting up or putting up in a warehouse or a barn. Sanitation facilities were primitive. Passengers would provide their own food or pick it up along the way. Schedules were erratic. There might be a boiler explosion, but if the passengers were lucky, the boiler would be thrown upward and forward of the locomotive as it moved along. They might experience a derailment. And there were problems with slowing and stopping trains as brakemen risked their lives atop boxcars, keeping their balance and ducking obstructions as they turned the braking wheels. There might even be screams of horror as rail workers were squeezed between cars while attempting to couple them together. In the late 1850s, iron rails were 3.5 inches high, and they weighed about 56 pounds per yard. These rails would break, so track walkers patrolled the lines in winter during both the night and at daytime. In comparison, a century later, steel rails were 5 inches high and weighed between 80 and 90 pounds per yard versus the 56. Variances still occur, I think, in rail weight based on the frequency and weight of the trains that traverse them. During April, May, and June of 1856, some 1,300 European immigrants arrived at the Iowa City train depot. Perhaps this scene depicts their earlier arrival at New York Harbor. These were Mormon people who still had a 1,400-mile journey ahead of them before they would arrive at Salt Lake, Utah. The first Mormons to arrive had made the trek a decade before that, but with the help of wagons. But the people in this group were poor, and the church could not afford to outfit them with wagon trains, so what happened? The idea of the handcart was born. A number of markers in Coralville and a namesake road in Iowa City commemorate the time that the Mormons spent here. Here is the bronze sculpture near the Marriott Hotel at the Iowa River Landing in Coralville. By the way, the Marriott is a Mormon-owned chain. This is a plaque commemorating the handcart immigration. It's located further south on Mormon Trek Boulevard in the Mormon Handcart Park. I realize the print's too small to read, just to show you this. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852, and the Dred Scott decision was handed down in 1857, the one that declared that blacks were property, therefore could be taken from state to state without any restrictions, and they had very little rights, of course. These events all added to the racial tension already in the air and gave rise to increased abolitionist fervor. Perhaps the most famous zealot was John Brown. In March of 1859, Brown came through Iowa City with a group of 12 liberated slaves taken from Kansas. On the morning of March 10th, the first eastbound train out of Iowa City dropped off an empty boxcar on a siding near a mill in West Liberty. The liberated families were loaded onto the freight car, and later in the morning the car was coupled with another eastbound train, eventually made its way to Detroit. And soon after, these people were brought into freedom at Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Now, by the 1870s, close to 24 different gauges of track were in use in the United States. Gauge is a measure of distance between the rails. By 1886, almost all trains were running on a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, which was adopted from the British system. Many locomotives had been imported from England. In the South, the standard was a gauge of 5 feet, but the southern rail lines were converted to the 4 foot 8.5 inch gauge by 1886. This limestone tunnel was reportedly built by the owners of the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad for the purpose of water drainage. This probably dates to the mid-1800s, around the time that the railroad came through in 1855, maybe right during that time. Do any of you know what nickname has been ascribed to this structure? It's locally known as Dead Man's Cave. Have you heard of Dead Man's Cave? Anybody?
So where is Jackson Street?
Well, let me tell you how to get to it in other terms. You would go off the north end of Pine Street, off of Lower Muscatine Road, Kirkwood, where they come together in that bend. And also on an alley off of Jackson Street. Jackson Street runs east and west off of 7th Avenue, near the south end of 7th Avenue, before about a block and a half before the tracks. I've heard two legends pertaining to the naming of Dead Man's Cave. Here's the access from the north or south side. You can kind of see the opening there. One legend has it that a person was shot in the passageway. The other subscribes to the belief that the roof of the tunnel collapsed and killed somebody, but maybe neither one, who knows. Another standard that was adopted in 1883 was that of standard time. Did you ever think about our time zones and how they came to be? And before that, different communities often kept their own regional time. This is a 1875 Iowa City City Directory entry. From that, we can see that the railroad and post office run by Chicago time 17 minutes faster than Iowa City time. On November 18th, 1883, the country was divided into the 4 time zones that we know today, with each having 1 hour difference between adjacent ones. So we've learned that travel on the early rail lines was far from luxurious, but advancements were rapid. In 1868 to 1869, wood-burning locomotives were being converted to coal burners. In the same era, lighting in the passenger cars had gone from candles to coal oil lamps to gas. By the late 1860s, steel rails manufactured by the Bessemer process were beginning to replace the less satisfactory iron rails. Also in 1869, sleeping cars were introduced. Pullman wasn't the only sleeping car producing company, but perhaps the most famous one. A side note, when company founder George Pullman died in 1890, Abraham Lincoln's son Robert Todd Lincoln took over as president of the company. I have a personal story about the Pullman car. A friend of mine took a ride on a Pullman sleeper with his family back in the 1950s. They encountered bed bugs. When the gentleman of the home returned home, he wrote the company a letter expressing his displeasure. He received a very nice letter back assuring him that the matter was being investigated, insisting all would be taken care of. He happened to turn the letter over, and there printed in pencil was this, quote, "Send this SOB the bedbug letter." I hope I haven't offended the Pullman Company, but I'm just trying to report what I think are the facts here. Dining cars were introduced about the same time that the sleepers were. 2 very significant developments came about in the 1870s. The adoption of the Westinghouse air brakes on passenger trains, so they didn't have to be standing on top and turning those wheels, and an automatic coupling system. Here we see the dangerous practice of hand braking on the top there. At the bottom of the image, I'm showing the old link and pin coupler mechanism that was responsible for many injuries, even deaths, and then what was called the Janney automatic coupler that allowed workers to step out of the way when coupling was carried out. In 1875, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, which is what the Mississippi and Missouri evolved into, arrived and left Iowa City eastbound 4 times a day, and also arrived and left Iowa City westbound 4 times per day. In 1878, the railroad announced this line has a full equipment of elegant dining and restaurant cars only by this company. run only by this company. In the 1878 through 1879 Iowa City Directory, to quote, "The means of communication at present between Iowa City and the outside world are the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific, and the Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern Railroads." That latter one we're going to speak of in a moment. Also in that directory, there was this ad for the railroad, the bridge that crossed the Mississippi River between Davenport, Iowa, and Rock Island, Illinois. It was completed in February of 1873. It was 1,550 feet, 6 inches long, and was divided into 5 spans and 1 draw. 1,550 feet and 6 inches, mind you. I like that. That's quite precise. The Rock Island Railroad Depot at Wright Street, the one that we know of today, was built in 1898, replacing the original one located to the east at South Johnson Street. Here's what the depot looks like today. It now houses a law office and at least one other business, and some of the interior is still in its original state. The golden age or era of passenger service was in the 1930s and 1940s when the lightweight diesel-powered streamlined passenger trains were introduced. Accommodations included such things as air conditioning, reclining seats, adjustable footrests, sleepers, and elegant dining cars. To quote Irving Weber pertaining to travel by him and his wife, quote, "We appreciated the fine service, linen, tablecloth, and napkins, fine china, silverware, and a vase of flowers. Oh yes, the final touch of elegance, which I will never forget, was the silver finger bowl with a slice of lemon at the conclusion of the dinner." Passenger rail service to and from Iowa City ended in 1970. In that same year, the federal government intervened to keep rail passenger service afloat in the United States. Congress passed the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970, which established Amtrak. This is a look today of the railroad bank along the line through the East Iowa City neighborhood. The railroad has chosen to place its discarded ties down the bank. This has created an increased odor of creosote. Also, rainwater could carry these contaminants into Ralston Creek, where the railroad line nears the creek in the Longfellow neighborhood. Okay, let's talk about the Calico Railroad. Anybody heard of the Calico Railroad? Before the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad was organized, another railroad was surveying a route between just north of Lyons, Iowa, and Iowa City. This railroad would collapse in infamy, carrying the moniker the Calico Railroad. It was known as the Lyons, Iowa Central Railroad Company, and it was at the north end of Clinton, Iowa. The Lyons planned to reach all the way to Council Bluffs, about 308 miles. They did a lot of grading work in the Iowa City area, and besides there, you can also see evidence from the Iowa City Community School building that used to be the Press Citizen building, looking off of that. The story was that there was a Mr. H.P. Adams of Syracuse, New York, as one of the directors of the railroad. He was an eloquent speaker, came through various Iowa counties encouraging the issuance of railroad bonds. He absconded with the funds and was later found to be a fugitive from justice. When he pulled up stakes in Iowa, a large number of Irish immigrant workers and their families, about 2,000, were left stranded near Lyons. Most or all of the railroad bed between Lyons and Iowa City had already been completed. The workers were compensated in lieu of wages with things like groceries and dry goods, but even those things ran out before the workers were totally compensated, thus the derisive name of the Calico Railroad. That was the end of that one. Now, has anyone heard of the plug line? In 1877, this line reached Iowa City. It was a branch line off of the Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern Railroad, the BCR&N. It was originally named the Burlington, Cedar Rapids, in Minnesota. Through the years, as one reads about railroad history and ownership, things can become pretty confusing because of all of the name changes. Through takeovers and mergers, there were lots of name changes. The BCR&N was a north-south route that connected Burlington with Cedar Rapids with connections to Minneapolis and St. Louis. So the line that ran into Iowa City was known locally as the Plug, P-L-U-G. And it went from Iowa City to a railway crossing at Elmira And that's the only way you could get to Cedar Rapids by rail in those days. Only two trains ran each day, one in the morning, one in the evening, so it wasn't the best service. The station for the plug in Iowa City was at the present location of the Robert A. Lee Recreation Center on Gilbert Street, or maybe just east of it, but right in that area. So here's what the area looks like today. This is a view of the Burlington Street Depot with the train pointing to hills. The track ran along the south side of the New Pioneer Co-op on Van Buren Street, looped around to the north going down part of present-day Jefferson Street along Ralston Creek, through East Iowa City, and then following Ralston Creek it left town to the northeast. This is a passenger train leaving the Burlington Street Depot heading to Elmira in about 1900. At Elmira, there was a lunchroom hotel building. It was quite a busy rail intersection in its day. And here's the depot at Elmira. So this was the connection from Iowa City to Elmira. If you were to stay on one train and go to Cedar Rapids from Iowa City, you would come from Iowa City like this, go down here, back up onto this line, and then go this way up to Cedar Rapids. There may have been changes of trains too to affect that type of a trip. And this was how the plug line coursed through Iowa City. It came through East Iowa City, which in this map was a separate entity. It wasn't part of Iowa City. It came through around B Street or A Street through East Iowa City. The former fairground location was there. It came up, went down along Jefferson Street and down through by the New Pie and so forth. And part of that rail line stayed there for quite some time. I think I have a slide showing that right here. This is a 1960 map that still shows part of the rail line there. And you remember there was a lumber yard that it serviced? Some of you may. Yeah, that's probably basically all it did toward the end of the line like that. Eventually, the Chicago Rock Island Pacific took over the BCRNN. Since the late 1870s, the Rock Island had a substantial interest in it, and that was increased until by 1885 it had a majority of the outstanding capital stock. 1903, Rock Island purchased it, set about improving the track throughout the system, but the line was abandoned between Elmira and Iowa City in the late 1920s. The last year for passenger service on the plug was 1924, and most of the rail had been removed by 1930. It probably never had much economic importance, probably really never earned its keep. This is the original office building of the BCRNN Railway in Cedar Rapids, just as it looks today. We can see quite a lot of evidence of the former plug line in Iowa City today. This is the limestone structure that was put in place to shore up the bank of Ralston Creek. New Pioneer Co-op is right there, the white building. All that was laid in by the railroad back in the 1800s. Evidence can be seen of the line where it went across the street with the dips in the roadway right there. Many of you know of this restaurant as Lou Henry's or the Maid-Rite, Midtown. On this northeast portion is angled off quite a bit. Why was that so?
Railway line.
The railway line went, how close to that, Rich, do you suppose? Just within feet, huh? Rail line went so close to that building that when they built it, it had to be angled off like that. Now, are you familiar with this little area off of College Street? You go a little bit west on College Street from 7th Avenue and look off diagonally down the way. There's a view of it today. Here's where the rail line crossed the street. And that was not an alley, that was the rail line that went down through that area. This is Ralston Creek and Court Hill Park, just south of Friendship Avenue. Again, the limestone work of the 1870s is evident right there. This is a section of discarded track that I found in Ralston Creek right nearby there. And these limestone blocks are from the original plug line structure that kids use and play on in the park there. This is a massive limestone bridge structure that you can see near the former site of Elmira, which again is about 8 miles northeast of Iowa City. Very wide, massive limestone structure for the rail line. Now we get into the Krandic, or the interurban. Same thing, they're synonymous. Cedar Rapids may have called it the interurban, we may, or vice versa, I can't remember which. One town would call it the Krandic, one the interurban. After the introduction of electricity, it was soon adapted for powering rail cars. In the late 1880s, communities in many parts of the United States introduced local rail service with power supplied by overhead electrical lines. So by the 1880s, the cars ran both within communities and between neighboring ones. Those running between towns were generally called interurbans, and those running within towns, streetcars. Of course, unlike the coal and wood-burning steam locomotives of the day, these were clean and pollution-free systems. The automobile was in its infancy when the electric trains began, allowing the trains to enjoy a relatively long tenure before meeting their demise. Eventually, the mass ownership and flexibility of the automobile killed most electric train travel. But still, we've got electric train lines in a lot of places, don't we? Chicago, by using an under rail, a side rail. Philadelphia, New Orleans, they still have electric trains. Well, a Captain Stephen L. Dowse and Isaac B. Smith got the idea to incorporate an electrical railway system as part of the Cedar Rapids Electric Light and Power Company. This was not one of the first electric railroads in the country, but it brought forth some significant innovations that I'll tell you about. In 1901, Dowse and Smith received a Cedar Rapids streetcar franchise with a connection to build an interurban railway between Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. In 1903, rail line, electric wire, and bridge construction began under the name of the Cedar Rapids and Iowa City Railway and Light Company. On August 13, 1904, with fanfare that included brass bands, the first interurban train was run. It provided for an immediate improvement in passenger travel between Iowa City and Cedar Rapids. The other rail system operating, of course, was the awkward plug that required the transfer at Elmira, and it was just a very poor service at once or twice a day. From the outset, the Krandic, which was the acronym for the Cedar Rapids and Iowa City line, was primarily a passenger line. But from the start, freight cars also brought coal into Cedar Rapids. The Krandic founders chose alternating current. That was a current system that was devised by Westinghouse that was countering the direct current system of Edison, which didn't make it. The Krandics made their company then one of only 3 in the nation using alternating current. It was the first interurban electric railroad in the nation that used 60-cycle rotary converters, the first that operated from lighting generators, the first to use automatic voltage regulators, and the first to install the very efficient and powerful narrow-gap electric motors in its railway cars. Within 30 years, these innovations were standard in railway and streetcar operations all over the country. Later, the interurban was extended from Cedar Rapids to Mount Vernon and Lisbon. This was car number 1, Krandic's first passenger car. There were approximately 27 miles of track between Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, and there were as many as 60 stops. But the trains would stop just about anywhere. 13 trains were scheduled each way, making the 27-mile trip in 75 minutes. The line was on private right-of-way except for the portions within each city. When the interurban rail bed was prepared on the west side of the Iowa River in Iowa City, about 100 horses were utilized to help dig out the cut. The interurban and the town of Swisher came into existence in that same year of 1904. No coincidence. 200 acres of the Benjamin Swisher farm, which was settled by Swisher in 1841, was platted as the town of Swisher. 3 of Swisher's sons lived in Iowa City, and they, in conjunction with Mr. Dowse of the interurban, paid the Swisher estate $8,000 for the 200 acres of the Swisher farm. The right-of-way through the town was given to the interurban as well as space for a depot for the sum of $1. Lots in this new town were then auctioned off. On August 22nd, 1904, before the electric cars were operating, a special steam train with 4 passenger cars came down the new interurban tracks and brought 300 Iowa Cityans to Swisher and the auction. They sold 53 lots that day, netting $5,400. This 1910 University of Iowa campus map shows how the Krandic line ran in the downtown area of Iowa City. So you know where it comes across the river and Iowa Avenue, and then it came down, looped around, and of course there. Here's an image of the interurban ticket office. It might have been in Iowa City, I'm not sure. Just, was it? Somebody say? Yeah. Iowa City. Housewives could travel to the largest shopping venues in Cedar Rapids using Krandic, and school traffic was a significant source of revenue also. The rail line served the University of Iowa, Coe College, and Cornell College. One lady recounted the importance to her of the interurban. In 1915, her only means of transportation was a horse and buggy, but the interurban allowed her to travel from Lisbon to Cedar Rapids and then on to Iowa City to visit a relative in the hospital and then get back to Lisbon all in the same day. As much as 300 gallons of milk often came down from a farm north of Iowa City to the Sidwell Dairy. Isn't that the one where Weber was the president? This was nicknamed the Milk Can Special. The special would also pick up a few kids who were late to school. The Krandic carried especially heavy traffic on football Saturdays. Some of you might remember hearing about this story. It was a noteworthy event in 1922. In November of that year, 10,000 people reportedly had driven to Iowa City for the Iowa-Minnesota game. During the game, heavy rains came down. The dirt roads in all directions became virtual quagmires. 500 cars between Iowa City and Cedar Rapids were stuck, and that left about 1,500 fans stranded. Some who were stuck close to the interurban tracks abandoned their cars and caught trains to Iowa City or Cedar Rapids. Over the next couple of days, farmers with teams of horses pulled the cars out of the mud. Many of them were taken to North Liberty, where they were loaded on flat cars and shipped either to Cedar Rapids or Iowa City. Traffic on the Krandic gradually increased through the 1920s. In 1926, 16 trains were scheduled daily, providing hourly service. During the Depression years, passenger traffic, you might have expected, declined sharply. So in 1932, only 8 daily round trips were scheduled. By 1937, they were back up to 10 round trips per day. However, by this time, what was going on? The private automobile was becoming the predominant mode of transportation. In 1939, the Krandic bought 6 lightweight, high-speed interurban cars from an Ohio electric company that went out of business. The cars were repainted, refurbished. They could top 80 miles an hour. They were put into use running mail, baggage, and passengers. During the Second World War, gas rationing came and rubber shortages curtailed private car usage. So during the mid-1940s, the ridership was nearly 600,000 per year. That's an average of about 1,600 per day. During the post-war years, again, ridership dropped dramatically, until by 1950, the passenger total dropped to less than 30,000. Yet there were still 12 daily weekday trains. Most riders were content to swing and sway the Krandic way on a brightly painted galloping goose or yellow comet car. But those who had a little too much to drink might refer to some of these cars as the vomit comets. A young lady recalled, "When I was in my first year at the university, in I think it was 1940, I rode the Krandic every day from Cedar Rapids to Iowa City, and on the way home from class, I often went to the back of the car and took a nap. Usually the operators let me know when they got to my stop, but once they forgot. I rode back and forth between Iowa City and Cedar Rapids until about 11 o'clock at night." In July 1952, service was cut to 6 weekday trains and 4 Sunday trains. Also, service to downtown Iowa City was dropped and trains terminated at the Iowa City Yard about 1/4 mile from downtown. In November 1952, service was cut to 2 trains each way and on weekdays only. Finally, the end came on May 30th, 1953. On this last day of passenger service, each of the 300 passengers got a souvenir ticket. All 6 of the high-speed cars were packed with dignitaries. On board were local reporters and a Navy man on furlough, a man who arranged his furlough so that he could be on the last ride. He was the person who came the farthest for the ride. He said he could see why the Krandic was so popular, because the cars were comfortable and the track was smooth. He said that after the Navy and college, he's spent more than 30 years in railroading. Also among these last passengers was an Alfred N. Scales of Iowa City. Scales had ridden the first passenger train in 1904. At Iowa City, a band played Auld Lang Syne as the train left. Within 2 years, the brightly colored yellow cars went into retirement in trolley museums all over the country. By the end of 1953, the electric wires and poles along the line had been removed. Krandic locomotives were converted to diesel electrics, and freight traffic began the boom. More than 500,000 tons were shipped that very first year. Now we're going to talk about the streetcar. So dropping back in time, I'm going to talk about the final segment, which is the streetcar. As I mentioned, the Krandic went into operation in 1904. And at that same time, there had been talk of having a streetcar for service within Iowa City. In 1908, the Rundle Edition to Iowa City came about, offering some 274 home lots. If 80 lots were sold, the Rundle Land and Improvement Company vowed to arrange for the financing of a streetcar into the new addition. In the spring of 1908, the city of Iowa City granted a franchise to a Mr. Hamiel and a Mr. Negus to practically all of the streets of Iowa City which the company would consider most desirable to lay track on. On November 15, 1909, an Iowa City newspaper stated that if at least 80 lots were sold, a reliable bonding company would furnish sufficient funds to build the line. This addition would bridge the open space between the city limits and East Iowa City. East Iowa City came into being as a rural subdivision or factory town all by itself in 1900. Electric streetcars were not new to the state of Iowa at that time. In fact, the first one went into service in Des Moines in 1888. That was the second electric streetcar line in the entire United States. The O.S. Kelly Manufacturing Company had its plant on the south side of Sheridan Avenue. Here. I think that's Sheridan. Yes, it was right by the railroad tracks. That's the O.S. Kelly factory. You remember it probably as the drain tile factory called what? Advanced Drainage Systems, ADS. But originally the factory, which opened around 1899, produced farm equipment and small gasoline engines. Its plant manager was a Mr. James H. Maggard, for whom a nearby street has been named. Mr. Maggard was interested in establishing an electric street railway that would run to the plant, and he hoped this would also encourage citizens to buy lots in the Rundle Addition. The company was known as the Iowa City Electric Railway Company. Mr. Maggard was one of its directors. The Rundle Land and Improvement Company owned the Negus' franchise. These lots were sold, and so the first streetcar line was built. It ran from the Clinton Street, College Street intersection. I think I have it here. I don't have it quite yet. Well, I'll show you a map of that in a moment here. This newspaper advertisement announced that they had been sold. The streetcar line had been put into service. Now the Rundle Company was encouraging citizens to continue to buy lots to the new addition. The first streetcar line opened with the first car making the circuit 1910, November 17, 1910. Fare was 5 cents. Same amount of money that would buy a scoop of ice cream or a Coke. In the beginning, the cars had a motorman and a conductor. Later, one man served as both motorman and conductor. Here's the route of the first streetcar line. So it went down to where the factory was, the O.S. Kelly factory, from the downtown area right through where the Ped Mall is now. Burlington Street came down Muscatine and then went down Rundle. Well, that's why Rundle Street's so wide, because it had the streetcar line right down the middle of it. By 1915, 4 more streetcar lines were completed. Before some of the routes were finalized, local merchants vied to have lines run down their streets so that shoppers would be dropped off right in front of their stores. Of course, they had to settle on some particular place to build them. I've often wondered, it's kind of cut off, and I wondered why it went up all the way to just past the Hy-Vee store up on Dodge. I wouldn't think there would have been too much going on back in those days. But
The dairy was out there. Swanner's Farm Dairy.
the dairy?
Swanner's.
Swanners. Okay.
Swanner's Farm Dairy.
Okay. This shows how the streetcar system served the city when it began its operation. I have outlined in red the city limits up until March of 1910. And on March 21st, 1910, a vote was put before the people of the city and the county as to whether they would extend the city limits, and it passed. And it basically doubled the size of Iowa City. And so the yellow showed where they extended to after that. The streetcar company ran into financial problems, and in 1928 was purchased by Henry Negus, an Iowa City attorney who was one of the original stockholders. By the early 1930s, buses began replacing the streetcars. In fact, bus service had really started in the mid-1920s. This image shows the intersection of Washington and Dubuque Streets. And that must be the old, what hotel? Jefferson Hotel. Irving Weber stated that the photograph was taken in 1915, but Bob Hibbs said the year was 1925. But what I want to point out is the so-called Go Anywhere city bus. Maybe here?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, This would be what a mid-1920s bus would look like up in the top there. And to remind us of how the automobile was coming in and dramatically displacing the streetcar, to show a picture of a period car. Here's some interesting pleas. These were pleas from the Iowa City Electric Railway Company, the streetcar company, as printed in the newspapers. So they would say, for example, motorists who pick up people waiting for the streetcar are working the same hardship on us that Free Sandwich Man would affect on the restaurateur. So they're kind of desperate, I guess. And that was just in the mid-1920s, before they finally went out of business. Yeah, I was going to say that Bob Hibbs, when he looked back and made a comment, he noted that Iowa City buses were traversing 124 miles over 17 routes, compared to the only 5 streetcar lines that covered a mere 6 miles. So, of course, the versatility of the bus was just nothing like the streetcars could do. I don't know exactly when the streetcar service ended. It was probably 1931. The tracks were either removed or paved over in some cases. So, present passenger rail service. What do we have in Iowa City today? Well, not much, huh? Since 2004, I believe it was, so about 10 years, we've had the Hawkeye Express that's conveyed football fans from Coralville to Kinnick Stadium about 6 times a year. That's the extent of our present rail service. Shortly after the stadium was built in 1929, a siding was laid along the railroad adjacent to the stadium. A siding is a parallel line where a train can pull off and permit the passage of trains on the main line. Football special trains serviced the stadium until 1974 on the Rock Island line. That's when the last trains ran from the Quad Cities. But 30 years later, in 2004, the trains began running again only from Coralville. What about the proposed passenger rail service? Have any of you been keeping up with that a little bit? I'm not sure if I have all of this straight, but here's what I have on this so far. At the present time, Iowa has 2 national long-distance passenger rail lines from Chicago to the West Coast. They cross the southern part of Iowa. They're the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe Railroad that has Amtrak service from Chicago to Mount Pleasant to south of Omaha and on to the west. Another one, Burlington route from Chicago to Fort Madison to Kansas City. But Iowa's largest communities do not have convenient passenger rail links to Chicago, Omaha, wherever else you want to go, big cities. Iowa's been examining expanding intercity passenger service since 1996. A coalition of Midwestern states known as the Midwest Regional Rail Initiative has studied the feasibility and economic benefits of a regional intercity system. In 2004, the MWRRI issued a plan. Can't read it, but I just wanted to show you that there's a plan. A number of publications have come forth in regard to the proposed line. It's not intended that you read it, like I said. Well, my understanding is that the Illinois has approved a plan to bring passenger rail service to the Quad Cities and Dubuque. But thus far, Iowa has rejected the plan to carry the service through our state. Well, that's controversial. A lot of people blame the administration in Des Moines. Apparently, a large number of federal support was offered, but there would also be a lot of expense on the part of Iowa and annual maintenance costs. Quite controversial based on my conversation with a number of friends and acquaintances. Many people are not convinced of the need and feel that the added costs would place an unnecessary burden on our state. On the other hand, many have condemned our governor and/or legislature for their failure to approve the plan. I don't think it's a dead issue, but with the present government, it appears that the measure will not go forward. Anybody have anything to add maybe when we get done? Well, here, so to summarize, this very busy slide shows the array of passenger rail lines that once existed, and, well, they don't anymore for passengers, of course. It includes the Lyons, Iowa rail line, which is this one on top here, that never even laid rail. So that's kind of quite a network that we've had in Iowa City over all these years. So we've had a rich history of rail transportation, but like most cities in the United States, we've lost the means by which people can travel by rail to and from Iowa City. I imagine it's going to be the political climate and economic considerations that are going to dictate whether future rail travel will one day return to Iowa City. So that is the end of the line for the railroad talk, and